We are getting closer to Tribbie's release during the first half of version 3.1 of Honkai Star Rail. We finally have her full kit, and she seems to be following the trend of every limited Harmony character being really good on their release. So today, we're going to go over Tribbie's full kit and overall value to see whether or not you should be pulling for her on your account. So Tribbie is going to be a Quantum Harmony character, which is pretty cool that we're finally seeing some Quantum characters come into the game again. And for her basic attack, I normally do just kind of glaze over the basic attacks, nothing really too crazy, but the one thing I do want to talk about for Tribbie here is that her basic attack is actually a blast attack, making it a bit unique from most other characters' basic attacks, but outside of that, it doesn't have any other mechanics on it. But you are going to be using her basic attack a decent amount of the time because of the way her skill works. Upon using Tribbie's skill, she's going to gain the Numinosity effect for 3 turns. This effect will have its duration reduced at the start of every one of Tribbie's turns, making it work exactly like Ruan Mei's skill and Robin's skill, which is really good. And while Numinosity is active, all allies will receive an all-type res pen buff for the duration of the Numinosity state, which is really good because that's going to help Tribbie to support really any kind of DPS regardless of what stats that DPS scales on. So that is already going to make Tribbie very universal. Then for Tribbie's ultimate, she is going to do an AoE attack and she's going to activate a zone. The zone is going to last for 2 turns and has a similar duration decrease that the skill has, where it'll decrease at the start of every one of Tribbie's turns. And in the zone, enemies inside of it will take 30% increased damage. And anytime allies attack while the zone is up, Tribbie is going to deal an additional proc of quantum damage per target that is hit, and that damage is only going to be applied to the enemy with the most HP of the targets that were hit. So if your DPS has an AoE attack, it is going to proc for 5 hits, and that is going to go onto the enemy with the most HP, which is probably, in most situations going to be the elite or boss enemy. So that'll be a good way to get some extra damage on them. And speaking of damage, let's talk about Tribbie's talent. So anytime an ally uses their ultimate, Tribbie will actually launch an AoE follow-up attack. This follow-up attack can only trigger 1 time per character, but whenever Tribbie uses her ultimate, that count will reset. So per ultimate, you can get at most 3 guaranteed follow-up attacks, basically, as long as you're using your ultimate with your other characters, which is really good to get a bit of extra damage in, and Tribbie actually does some pretty decent damage. So she does also act as like a mini sub DPS in that aspect, as long as you are making sure that all of your other characters are using their ultimate once for every time Tribbie uses her ultimate. Then for Tribbie's technique, she has pretty much the exact same technique as Ruan Mei, where upon activating it, you are going to activate her skill right at the start of battle, which is so good so that you don't have any downtime on her skill's all-type res pen buff. So now let's look at her traces here. For her Ascension 2 trace, every time she uses her follow-up attack, she's going to get a 72% damage dealt bonus for 3 turns, and this can stack up to 3 times, meaning that if you use that follow-up attack for all of your allies, you're going to have the max boost for that, which is going to be a pretty nice damage increase for Tribbie. Then for her Ascension 4 trace, whenever her ultimate zone is up, Tribbie's max HP is going to increase by 9% of all of her allies' max HP, which can be really good if you have some high HP allies, because Tribbie's damage does scale off of her HP. So if you are getting a bigger buff from this A4 trace, then you can see a little bit of a damage increase as well to give her a bit more as a Harmony sub DPS kind of character. Then for her Ascension 6 trace, Tribbie is able to regenerate 30 energy at the start of battle, and whenever your allies hit enemies, Tribbie is going to get 1.5 energy back per target that is hit by any ally. So Tribbie is going to be able to get some pretty solid energy back in battle, so you can keep using those ultimates and refreshing her uses of her follow-up attack. Then for her stat traces, Tribbie does get 12% crit rate, 37.3% crit damage, and 10% max HP, giving her a bit more in the way of her being a sub DPS, since her buffs by themselves are already pretty solid. So they are just giving her more stuff for her to increase that damage and provide that to the team as well. Then lastly, for the kit section here, let's go over Tribbie's Eidolons. So for her E1, during the ultimate zone and when activating the additional quantum damage procs during the zone, it's going to deal an additional 24% of the additional quantum damage, but instead as true damage, which is really good because you have that guaranteed amount of damage as well, regardless of any kind of resistances and stuff like that. So you are going to get a lot of value out of that E1 there. Then for her E2, while the ultimate zone is up, there is going to be a 120% increase of the additional quantum damage dealt whenever allies attack enemies, and it is also going to include an extra instance of additional quantum damage dealt, meaning that if you hit 3 enemies, for example, with a blast attack, the amount of damage that Tribbie does with the additional proc is actually going to count for 4 enemies, so you are getting a bit of extra damage per attack as well. Then for her E4, all allies will be able to ignore 18% of the enemy's defense whenever Tribbie's skill is active, which should be all the time, which is a pretty crazy E4. Then lastly, for her E6, she's going to be able to launch her follow-up attack for free upon using her ultimate, and her follow-up attack also gets a massive over 700% damage dealt increase just permanently, which is pretty insane. I mean, it's an E6, so of course it's got to be insane. So that is Tribbie's kit there. So now let's talk about her overall value. So I think Tribbie is going to be a really good universal support character. And I think the biggest reason for this is because her 2 main buffs, being the all-type res pen buff and the damage taken by enemies effect, is going to be able to work on all DPS characters regardless of what stats they scale on for their damage. You have, HP scalers, especially with My Day coming up. He seems to be an HP scaler. You have a lot of attack scalers as well. So really any characters will be able to benefit from res pen and damage taken. So that is going to be very good for, making sure that she is future proof or less likely to be power crept. And I do think that she is going to be a bit less likely to be power crept compared to other supports, which, keep in mind, a lot of other supports are already, pretty resistant to power creep just based on how much they provide to, the teams that they're on. And I do think a big character that people are thinking about when it comes to support is Robin. And while Robin is still very good and a top tier support, I do like Tribbie's more universal buffs in comparison to Robin having her massive buff being specifically an attack buff, which sure, a lot of DPSs do scale off of that, but if we are getting some HP scaling characters like My Day, then you're gonna see Robin not perform as well with those characters, and you're probably gonna want to run someone like Tribbie who can buff things outside of just attack. Now if we had an HP scaling, support character, that would be cool as well, or a HP buffing support character. But right now, I think res pen and damage taken is going to be very good for keeping her very universal. And we did mention this a bit before, but Tribbie also being a sub DPS is pretty cool as well, so you are getting a bit of extra damage from her. And it is not an Aventurine situation where people were saying, oh my god, Aventurine can do all this damage, but his damage was not really, that enticing when he came out. It's definitely not enticing right now, but Tribbie actually does seem to be doing some decent damage with her kit, especially with all of the, damage bonus she gets from that A2 trace. And I think overall she's going to end up working very well with erudition characters and any characters that can do blast or AoE damage, because you're going to be able to get some pretty strong procs of the additional quantum damage during her ultimate, and if those enemies can get their ultimates up faster, then you get the follow-up damage as well. So I think that the people who should be pulling for Tribbie are people who need more Harmony supports on their account. If you maybe have just like one limited Harmony support and you have a second team that's struggling a bit, pulling Tribbie is going to be pretty helpful since she is going to work in a lot of comps. And I think especially if you're missing Sunday and or Robin, I think Tribbie is going to be a very good character to pick up. And of course, depending on where your account is, because I know Robin's rerun banner is up right now, so depending on which one of them is going to be better for your account, I would choose between one of them for sure. And I think that if you have the Herda or any other strong AoE or blast characters, or plan to pull for any strong AoE or blast damage characters in the future, Tribbie is going to be a very good investment to make those characters better. Then on the flip side, I think that you maybe should think about either skipping Tribbie or just waiting for a rerun. If your account is good on Harmony supports, like if you have Sunday, you have Robin, you have a built RMC, but you need a better DPS, better sustain, and so on and so forth. So I think that if that's the case, or for some reason your account is just all single target damage dealers, then Tribbie might not be the most valuable pull for you right now. But I think that as more characters come out, I think her rerun is going to be insanely valuable, just like what happened to Robin, where people didn't really, or I don't think as many people pulled for Robin at first, but then everyone wanted her when that rerun came around. And I think a very similar thing is going to happen to Tribbie, especially if we get more characters that are either scaling off of HP, or if they include characters that are going to scale off of other stats later on, since Tribbie's buffs are going to be super universal for them. So overall, to wrap it up here, I think that there are going to be some accounts that might not need her right now, but I think that Tribbie not only is going to age extremely well, but I also think she could end up being even more valuable later on if we get DPSs that are going to be scaling on more than just attack, more than just, the usual stats. So let me know in the comments down below what you think of Tribbie and if you're going to be pulling her for your account. I might throw a couple 10 pulls at her, but I am going to be saving for my day. My day probably will end up working well with Tribbie, so having them both would be pretty good. But thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed and want to see more content from me, be sure to hit that subscribe button. But with that, everyone, I will see you all next time.